the magnitude of the American debt. In 2008, we witnessed the collapse of the American real estate market. In 2020, a global pandemic shook the economy. But what awaits us could be much worse: the inability of the United States to repay its national debt. Today, we will consider this threat that looms over the global economy. The U.S. national debt has reached dizzying heights, amounting to more than $34.8 trillion. It's a figure that makes you dizzy, isn't it? To put this in perspective, it's like every American owes about $100,000. This colossal debt has accumulated over the decades, fueled by costly wars, economic crises, and generous tax policies. This is the scale of the problem we are facing, and the question that arises now is, how can the United States handle such a mountain of debts? The consequences of a payment default. Let's imagine for a moment that the United States, the world's largest economy and issuer of the world's reserve currency, suddenly announces that it cannot pay its bills. This is not a simple hypothetical scenario, but a very real possibility that could trigger an unprecedented financial catastrophe. What would a U.S. default look like? In simple terms, this means that the government would not be able to make payments related to its debt obligations. This could happen if Congress does not raise the debt ceiling, which would prevent the Treasury from issuing new securities to pay for existing liabilities. The immediate consequences would be serious and far-reaching. First of all, the U.S. financial markets would suffer a massive shock. The stock market would probably experience a sharp and spectacular fall due to the collapse of investor confidence. This is not a classic stock market correction, but rather a crash that could wipe out trillions of dollars of wealth almost overnight. The impact on everyday life. While we have explored the broader economic consequences of a potential U.S. default, it is crucial to understand how this financial catastrophe would impact the daily lives of ordinary Americans. The effects would be profound, affecting all aspects of society. Let's start with employment. A default would likely trigger a severe economic downturn, leading to widespread job losses in various sectors. Companies faced with higher borrowing costs and lower consumer spending would be forced to lay off workers en masse. Small businesses, the backbone of the U.S. economy, would be particularly vulnerable, potentially leading to a wave of closures and bankruptcies. Inflation would skyrocket as the value of the dollar plummets. Imagine that you walk into your local grocery store and find that the price of bread has doubled overnight. This would not be a temporary peak. We are talking about sustained and rampant inflation that could quickly erode the purchasing power of your hard-earned money. Essential goods and services would become increasingly unaffordable for many Americans, leading to a sharp decline in living standards. Public services, already strained in many areas, would face drastic cuts. Local and state governments, heavily dependent on federal funding, would struggle to maintain basic services. Schools could be forced to cut staff or scale back programs. Infrastructure maintenance would be neglected, which could lead to dangerous roads and bridges. Emergency services could face budget cuts, which would have an impact on response times and capacities. The impact on personal savings and retirement funds would be devastating. As the stock market slumps, the value of 401(k) and other investment accounts would plummet. Many Americans could have their savings wiped out in a matter of days. Pensioners who depend on fixed incomes would be particularly vulnerable, as their nest egg decreases while the cost of living increases. The social repercussions of these economic shocks would be serious. Poverty rates would likely rise, with millions of Americans potentially falling below the poverty line. This sudden increase in economic difficulties could lead to an increase in crime rates, as desperate individuals resort to illegal means to survive. Social tensions would inevitably increase. History has shown that economic crises often lead to an increase in social unrest. We could see protests, strikes, and potentially even riots as people express their frustration and anger at the government's inability to manage the economy responsibly. Trust in institutions, already at historically low levels in many areas, would probably erode further. The government's inability to prevent or manage such a crisis could lead to a widespread loss of confidence in the political system. This erosion of trust could have lasting effects on American democracy, potentially leading to increased political polarization and the rise of extremist ideologies. The health system, already under stress, would face unprecedented challenges. As unemployment rises and people lose their health insurance, hospitals and clinics would be overwhelmed with patients unable to pay for care. This could lead to a public health crisis, with untreated preventable diseases and vulnerable populations suffering disproportionately. Education would also feel the impact. Public schools and universities, faced with budget cuts, may have to increase class sizes, reduce the offer of courses, or even close completely. This could have long-term consequences for the workforce and the competitiveness of the United States in the global economy. It is important to note that these consequences would not be limited to the United States. In our interconnected global economy, the effects of a U.S. default economy would reverberate across the globe. Countries heavily dependent on trade with the United States would see their economies suffer. The global financial system, based on the economic stability of the United States, could face a crisis of confidence. The options to avoid disaster. As we have seen, the United States is facing a monumental challenge with its national debt. But what can be done to avoid a financial disaster? Let's explore the options available to the U.S. government and why each has its own complications. First, there is the strategy of reducing public spending. It may seem like an obvious solution. If you are in debt, spend less, right? The United States could cut various programs, from defense to social services. However, this approach is far from simple. Drastic spending cuts could lead to job losses in the public sector, a reduction in services to citizens, and potentially a slowdown in economic growth. It is a delicate balance between financial responsibility and maintaining a functional company. Another option is to raise taxes. By increasing its revenues, the government could theoretically repay its debt over time. But this strategy also has its drawbacks. Higher taxes could reduce consumer spending and business investment, which could slow economic growth. There is also the political challenge. Tax increases are often unpopular with voters, which makes them difficult to implement. Then there is the controversial option of printing more money. The Federal Reserve could create additional dollars to pay off the debt. Although this may seem like an easy solution, it comes with significant risks. Too rapid an increase in the money supply can lead to inflation, potentially devaluing the dollar and eroding the purchasing power of American citizens. This is a short-term solution that could create long-term problems. Some economists suggest that a combination of these strategies may be necessary. By implementing moderate spending cuts, targeted tax increases, and carefully managed monetary policy, the United States may be able to gradually reduce its debt burden without causing serious economic disruptions. But there is another crucial factor at play here: investor confidence. The ability of the United States to manage its enormous debt is largely based on the confidence that other countries and investors have in the American economy. As long as investors believe that the United States will honor its debts, they continue to buy treasury bonds, effectively lending money to the government at relatively low interest rates. This trust is based on several factors. The status of the US dollar as the world's leading reserve currency gives it a unique advantage. The size and diversity of the US economy also provide a level of stability that attracts investors. However, if this confidence were to waver, perhaps due to a political impasse over the debt ceiling or signs that the United States is struggling to manage its finances, the consequences could be serious. A loss of investor confidence could lead to a rise in interest rates on US debt, which would make it even more difficult for the country to repay its obligations. It could also trigger a massive sell-off of US Treasury bonds, potentially causing a crisis in the global financial system. So what is the solution? Unfortunately, there is no easy answer. Any approach to managing the US national debt will require difficult decisions and potential short-term pain for long-term gain. This will probably involve a combination of strategies, carefully implemented over time. One thing is clear: ignoring the problem is not an option. The longer the United States waits to solve its debt problem, the more difficult and painful the eventual solution will be. It's a bit like treating a cavity. The longer you wait, the more extensive and expensive the treatment becomes. There is also a need to improve financial literacy and awareness among the American public. Understanding the implications of the national debt can lead to more informed voting decisions and potentially create the political will necessary for meaningful reform. Conclusion: a call for vigilance. As we have seen, the United States is facing a monumental challenge with its national debt. The consequences of a default would be catastrophic, affecting not only the American economy, but the entire world. We explored the potential impact on everyday life, from job losses to runaway inflation, and examined possible solutions, each with its own complications. But this is not only a problem for economists and politicians, this is a wake-up call for all of us. We must remain informed and vigilant on this crucial issue. Understanding the national debt and its implications can help us make better financial decisions and empower our leaders. Remember that financial responsibility is not reserved for governments. It starts with each of us. By managing our personal finances wisely, we contribute to a more stable economic future. Let's use this knowledge to build a safer financial world for generations to come.